So we've got used now to saying these are extraordinary times and unprecedented times and other such adjectives. And of course, we're moving now into a new phase of the pandemic and another phase of lockdown. Schools having been open for all of a day, thanks to the Education Secretary or the government's decision making, which may or may not be approved of, are now closed, or at least they are closed by government guidance, except of course for educating vulnerable children, the children of critical workers, and that definition has expanded. So there are more in school than there were in the first lockdown physically. And also some boarders in some of our schools who had already returned, of course, before the closure was promulgated. So we're back into remote learning. I think we're all familiar with how that works now, and many of our schools, in fact, I'd say the vast majority of them did that extremely well the first time round, and there was very good parental feedback from that. And we're back into that mode now. And of course, also we continue with mostly at least remote governing, and we've all had to learn different skills ourselves as governors in order to be able to continue doing our work. And there've been some pros and cons with that, bit more nimble, but also it's a challenge when you can't actually go in face to face, in particular for things like safeguarding. There are, of course, continuing pressures on staff, and our senior staff in particular have been under the cosh in terms of workload and not having much of a break for months and months and months. And we have to be very mindful of that. So the point about well-being of staff and looking after and managing staff during a pandemic is very, very important, and increasingly so, leaving aside issues around their own health and so forth. Also, of course, we've got continued issues around finances in our schools, especially around fees. And you will have seen, I'm sure, the most recent legal guidance note around fee reductions or fee adjustments in the light of a new lockdown and closure. And it's important that we get our decision making right in that respect. But of course, that also links into some continuing financial challenges for many of our schools. And I'm sure that that is going to come up during the breakout sessions and maybe the main sessions today. Potentially also, it raises some opportunities for some strategic opportunities in terms of mergers and acquisitions and so forth. So it will depend upon what position one has been in going into the pandemic, but things are not getting easier at the moment. Having said that, many of our schools are in a very strong position. Pupil numbers have remained high, much higher than many people predicted. And we went into the pandemic in a pretty good shape in spite of a lot of pressures about affordability, teachers' pension scheme, and indeed some political pressures which eased slightly after the last general election, but perhaps didn't entirely go away. So there's quite a lot there around finances and future viability. The situation around exams for 2021 is still unclear. We had what I think can only be described as a fiasco around the decision making on exams in 2020, and we know what happened with those. We still are waiting for any detailed guidance about what's going to happen with exams this year, public exams, I mean, most of them anyway, with some exceptions. And of course, our students are becoming increasingly anxious about that, as are the parents and of course the teachers, who keep having to say, well, I'm afraid we just don't know yet. So the lack of clarity is difficult there. We await further guidance. What will the new normal look like when we start to come out of the pandemic? Hopefully once the vaccinations really start taking effect and the numbers start going the right direction. A lot of questions around strategy for the new normal. A lot of questions also, meanwhile, around mass testing, health and safety, safeguarding in our schools, and vaccinations themselves. And then there are some questions coming up about the legality of the shutdown. At 11 o'clock this morning, AGBIS is going to be sending out a copy of a legal note put together by colleagues in the legal profession around the possibility of challenge from parents, for example, with regard to charitable schools closing to their beneficiaries when the government is providing guidance rather than enforcing it by law. But don't rush to change your decisions on that. I do, however, urge you to read that note carefully and make sure your decision making has followed the right process. And that will be coming out at 11 o'clock this morning, so will be available after you've finished this webinar. So there's an awful lot in the melting pot. One of the things that I mentioned just now was the teachers' pension scheme, and that question has not gone away, of course. And many schools which were waiting to see when some schools had already decided they were going to consult and potentially withdraw from the scheme. Many others were waiting to see, but decision making on that might have been made more acute by the other pressures of the pandemic. So this is a very live issue, and a growing number of schools and governing bodies are now having to bring this back to the top of their agenda. So I think that's an appropriate point at which to introduce Chrissy Scott from HCR, partner at HCR, who's going to take us through very briefly some key points about the current situation and an update on the situation with regard to the teachers' pension scheme. So over to you, Chrissy.
Thank you very much, Richard, and good morning, everyone. Although I can't see you, it's great to know that you are all there. Lots of familiar names and maybe faces later. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to AGBIS also. As many of you will know, we run an annual event with them about this time of the year in any event, which has always been really popular. This year, of course, it's virtual. And I would like to mention that AGBIS, along with the other sector associations, are working incredibly hard behind the scenes with the relevant bodies to answer all the questions that you have. So very, very active, a lot of work for them to do. And so thank you, Richard, to you and your colleagues for doing that on behalf of the sector. It's absolutely vital that schools have that support at this difficult time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the TPS. This is not a detailed session on options relating to the teachers' pension scheme. It's a short, probably around an 8-minute look at what we are seeing at the present time. And as Richard has said, it's very much still a current issue. I'm delighted as I head up the team at HCR in terms of the education work. I'm very well supported by colleagues. Some are here today. Rachel Parkin and Oliver Daniels do a huge amount of TPS work as well, and it's keeping us fairly busy. Please do ask questions in the chat as we go along, and if we have time, we'll get to those before the breakouts. If not, we'll pick them up afterwards at the Q&A session, or ultimately we will come back to you after today. So in terms of context, for the past 18 months, we've seen an increasing number of independent schools look at their membership of staying in the teachers' pension scheme. I'm aware there are a couple of academies on this webinar this morning. And of course, unfortunately, academies, well, unfortunately, you can't come out, but fortunately, it's funded, say so, for academies. So this bit of this morning is not something that you can do. So please do bear with me. Independent schools, some of you might have attended some of the sessions that we had last year, which were supported by AGBIS and the ISBA. We did a number of conferences in various places around the UK looking at this question of withdrawal. It was a key issue for independent schools, and it's only been emphasised in our experience by the pandemic. The figures suggest that around 190 schools have withdrawn from the scheme by Christmas 2020. So that's withdrawal. There are a number of other schools that have gone for a hybrid option. And of course, those won't have been picked up. So there are other schools that have addressed the issue of TPS, but in a slightly different way. As Richard had said, prior to last March, we saw a number of schools adopting this wait and see approach. COVID-19 has changed the landscape. Many schools, it forced them to look at that again, and we're finding it back at the top of the agenda. The current situation of the latest lockdown and this move to remote learning, possible impact on fees, as Richard has mentioned, has made the issue more pressing and time sensitive. It causes schools to focus on what they can control in terms of affordability issues, And do we continue to accept the increased employer contribution TPS rate, and where does that take you as a school? At the moment, we do not know the lasting impact on the sector in terms of the current pandemic and what that means for schools in the long term. And I know that Kate and Robin, no doubt, will, and probably Guy actually in his session, will pick that up in terms of finance strategy. They can talk about what's happening in the sector. In terms of TPS, it might mean that some schools who'd already consulted have actually gone back to the drawing board and are consulting with staff once again if their position has changed. There's also this question of future risks around the TPS. There's no guarantee as to what TPS will look like in the future, and schools are increasingly mindful of the risk of a further increase. Now, we do know that any increase should not come before April 2023. So that April 2023 date is really key, because if I was a governor of an independent school considering this, that would be my very last deadline. So I'd work back from there in terms of any consultational steps I need to be considering. The actuarial predictions say, all of them say there will be a further increase, possibly around 30% or possibly even higher. And whilst it's important to focus on the current impact of that cost on your school, uncertainty over the future increase and current issues such as the loss of commercial letting for a number of schools, etc., inevitably will form part of that business case for many schools. So in our experience, it takes about a year to consult fully, to get your business case together, consult, and then come out. So if I can go to the next slide, please. What I'm going to look at today is the question of phased withdrawal, because this is a new, so anyone that's been to our TPS discussions before, this is something new. And of course, what we must be mindful of as part of any consultation is the fact that, as Richard has already mentioned, there is a lot going on in schools at the moment. Teachers, all staff, including support staff, working harder than ever in order to ensure that the school continues to operate in the best way it possibly can. So anything like this is unlikely to be welcome. Staff may be anxious. They may have other worries outside of work, so retaining that goodwill is vital. However, equally important is considering the long-term sustainability of the school, which inevitably means staff and pupils. So phased withdrawal. So we have now at last the government response to the outcome of the phased withdrawal mixed economy consultation. That was launched in September 2019. Originally anticipated the response in the first quarter of 2020, didn't happen because of the pandemic. The phased withdrawal, which was called the mixed economy before, is a proposal that will allow independent schools to effectively close the gate to new members of the TPS. So any new member of staff, teaching staff that joins your school will not be able to enter the TPS, but your existing staff members will remain as active members. That is not currently permitted under the current TPS rules. There were a huge number of responses, over 600, and it's now going to be an option. It does require an amendment to the TPS regulations. The intention is they're going to be laid shortly, and this option will be available for schools from spring 2021. And the devil will be in the detail as always. However, we've now got a third lockdown, and whether the government will stick to that timetable. So the original response was expected first quarter 2020. It was pushed on considerably. Whether that timetable is now still realistic, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. We do know that the DfE are incredibly busy with guidance in relation to the pandemic. What it doesn't do, and it's recognised in the responses on the side there, it doesn't mitigate, it doesn't really help a school immediately. So if you're coming out or considering withdrawing from the TPS, because it's absolutely vital that you make those cost savings, phased withdrawal will not help with that, because it's going to take some time for all of those existing staff members to move out organically through the school and for the new members to come in. So how long until any saving? takes place. Some schools have looked at this and estimate it could be, a good 10 years till we get that. How high is your staff turnover? Will it actually cause staff to remain rather than move on? So a number of things to think about. Next slide, please. So what does this mean on a practical basis? If you're considering your options under TPS, you've not yet engaged in a consultation process, it's another option. So you need to consider it as part of your business case. So when you set out your business case, it's certainly something I'd suggest you put in your business case to show that governors have thought about it. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution. It is another possible option for dealing with the risk. You would, of course, acknowledge within your business case that it will have limited impact, certainly in the first year, I'd say a few years after implementation, and the benefits will be gradual as staff leave. It doesn't address the real risk of possible future increases to TPS employer contributions. So how much that presents a viable option will vary from school to school, depending on the circumstances. It is legitimate to reach conclusion that it does not offer a viable alternative to full withdrawal. So if this option is not going to reach your school, and it is an individual school by school decision, there isn't a one size fits all, then that is a legitimate decision to reach. But it's important that you factor that into your decision making and your business case when you're looking at your TPS risk. It would form part of your strategic thinking. And our view would be that it's better to preempt the questions from staff or the representatives who might ask about phased withdrawal, either in the business case or possibly also in a frequently asked questions document and FAQs for staff. Next slide, please. If you are currently engaged in consultation, we have a number of schools that are actively consulting and have consulted throughout the pandemic. It is in some ways more difficult because staff say, I haven't got time to think about this, but actually in a certain aspect, I sometimes think it's slightly easier to consult because it's virtual. You're not fitting quite so much around extracurricular activities, etc. If you're in consultation, timing of the response might not be helpful, although actually it is what it is. My view is you should review your position and the business case in light of the development. We know the trade unions will like the idea of a phased withdrawal because it protects some staff members' benefits. So rather than waiting for the staff representatives to come up with it, I would suggest that schools might want to, or governors might want to address it initially, perhaps as part of a consultation meeting, add it as an agenda item, write to the staff representatives. You might want to do an addendum to the business case. The governors will should consider it. Like anything, if the staff suggests something, the governors who are considering TPS should consider whether that makes a change to the proposal. There is a huge amount of documentation and template documents and guidance in the ISBA reference library. Please access that, even if you're at an early stage of consideration of what you're doing. And there's a note from us on phased withdrawal, so please do have a look at that. Next slide, please. If you've already exited, you do not, there was this concern that you might have to revisit your decision. You don't. If you've already made that decision and made that change to terms and conditions, that is how it will be. You're not forced to re-examine that. An employment tribunal will accept what were the circumstances at the relevant time, and they won't look to alter your decision. Tribunals accept that it's providing you've reached a reasonable decision, they won't then alter that. Staff might raise it. It might become an issue if you followed the hybrid route, so you haven't withdrawn, but you're offering a slightly different option. So if you followed a hybrid route, you might have something there, but generally not. And the final slide, please. So in terms of what's happening, we are still seeing schools continuing to make decisions. Virtual consultation is happening. It's just as it would for an in-person consultation. And as I said, sometimes I think it's possibly slightly easier. The key to a successful process is planning. Plan where you're going before and anticipate what questions might arise. You know your schools well. Good communication and being as transparent as possible.
Now is the time when it gives me great pleasure to introduce Guy Biggin of Crowe, who is going to talk to us about key financial indicators for 2021. So we've talked about the current situation and looked back a little bit over 2020, and now we are thinking about, sustainability and looking ahead. And this is why this is so important. So I'm delighted that Guy is with us today. He is a partner in the Cheltenham office of Crowe and will be well known already to many of you, I'm sure. And if you don't know, he works exclusively with educational and charitable organisations, offering his great experience in audit and risk management, as well as in governance, trading activities, fundraising, and all sorts of other issues arising in the sector. So no better person for our final speaker today than Guy Biggin. And Guy, I'm delighted to hand over to you now to take us away in this session. And if I could ask everybody again just to turn off their microphones and their video cameras so we focus on Guy, that would be great. And we'll come back together afterwards for the Q&A at the end. Guy, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about financial updates and key financial indicators and a little bit about stuff that's coming from the Charity Commission and things that my clients from the sector are talking to me about and have done over the last 9 months and quite a lot over the last 10 days. So if I'm going to say next slide quite a lot, but next slide, not a lot, I haven't got that many slides, but I thought there's a lot of governors on here, it'd just be useful to remind you of some Charity Commission guidance. I'm a governor of a school and a trustee of 4 other different charities, and I think this guidance has been very helpful over this period of time. So as a governor of a school, or indeed senior management of a school, I recommend you have a look at this. Get yourself onto the Charity Commission website. There's some good stuff around COVID, around serious incident reports, reserves, trading subsidiaries. One of the things I've talked a lot about with school clients about how, given the fact that a lot of trading subsidiaries of school clients or schools, they don't have to necessarily be a client, have not been carrying out the activities that they normally would, has put financial pressure on those trading subsidiaries. And how does that charity behave in relation to that charity that may have become loss-making or technically insolvent, and the support that you can put in place via loans, share options, etc. So that's something that's well worth a moment of your time to review, as is the guidance around managing financial difficulties. But I thought I'd pick up on 1 or 2 of them. If you can hit the next slide, that I think are worth the next slide, whoever, please. In terms of what other alerts are there that I think you should spend a little bit of your time having a look at, because it all links to our considerations of when we're looking at the finances and the operations of our schools. There's some good information around reporting matters of material significance. Believe it or not, I've had to do, well, you probably will believe it, I've had to do that as an auditor more times in the last 6 months than I have done in the last 20 years. Because of the impact of COVID and what's that done, and that has included a number of schools. And by that, I'm talking about reporting on modified audit reports. Not lots, but 1 or 2 times, and that is more than I'm used to doing in relation to that. So you need to understand what that means, and that guidance helps you. There's some guidance around there about whistleblowing, and I mentioned that. I know it's not this topic, but there's been more fraud in the last 6 months. Mainly cyber fraud than I've seen in a long time. And in schools, I've had 4, amongst my client base, 4 instances of cyber fraud, that has resulted in cash being extracted from schools. And there's a whole session on that. But I urge governors and senior management to read that guidance and also review their own policies and controls around cyber fraud. I mention it because it's absolutely linked to managing your financial position, because there is significant risk around that. And then senior executive pay is just down there to remind you that that is an area of focus. It was in 2014 from NCVO, but the SORP 2024, which is due out then, is going to look at more transparency around senior executive pay. So again, something to think about as a governor or a trustee or senior management. But I urge you to look at this guidance, because it does help you when you're making decisions in relation to your schools. But moving on to the next slide, I'm going to pick up on a number of the things that we've talked about. So there's lots of questions here and lots of things to consider that schools are considering. It is not me. I do in my own role as a governor of a school, but these are the indicators that I think are really important. And actually, we are in 2021, but a lot of the legacy in relation to our financial position is coming from the summer term, the autumn term, or Michaelmas term, and now going into the future. So I'm going to talk about debt. Debt is one of my key focuses when I look at schools and look at my own school. Why is that? Because clearly managing debt is a really significant risk, and ensuring that that is managed. What's been interesting is debt hasn't got as high as we thought it would do, generally speaking, as high as we thought it would do back in April. However, debt profile is changing, and that really is interesting. So what do I mean by that? When you look at your debt profile for your individual school, I'm absolutely sure that there'll be the usual suspects on there, people that are used to playing the game or are always on your debtors list, or you're having long conversations with. What's been interesting is the arrival of people on debtors lists who have never been on those lists before. And I think they are beginning to become a more significant risk than our usual suspects. And that is because those debtors are not used to being a debtor. In other words, it takes longer for them to admit that the chances of them repaying that debt is at risk, because they often put their heads in the sand and assume it's going to be okay over the period of time. And I think that's something you need to be looking at, and governors and senior management need to have those indicators in place, because as we go through the next year, 2 years, there is always a lag on financial implications like there have been from COVID over a period of time. There's always a lag on it. And let's also remember that actually people have been able to pay their school fees because they haven't spent any money on anything else. If you just think for a minute about last year, at the end of the summer term, you would have assumed that the summer term debt would have been significantly higher, generally speaking. But actually, lots of people didn't go on holiday in the Easter terms. Most people had earned the money to pay the summer term debt, and a lot of people didn't go on holiday in the summer holidays. All of which enables them to manage their expenditure profile and pay your fees. The longer this goes on, the more at risk that becomes. So I urge you to look at the debt and the profiling of that debt and how it is changing, and act quickly. The other thing that's interesting about debt is those that have called for hardship bursaries and continue to do so as we speak. There is real hardship out there. I'm not going to deny that, absolutely not. But schools are not banks. People who are asset rich need to look at alternative methods for paying your fees. What I'm not saying is don't help, but what I am saying is it is not your responsibility to cover people's lifestyles. And therefore there needs to be a strong focus on that. And a lot of people are doing, but it does worry me that schools are at risk of spending money on hardship that isn't necessarily hardship in the way that we might think it is. So that, coupled with the increased risk around debtor profiling, for me is a significant indicator that governors and senior management want to be on top of. So we entered January, and I had hundreds of phone calls, not hundreds of phone calls, that's a slight exaggeration, but a number of phone calls with my clients about what has happened as a result of moving into this new lockdown, lockdown 3. Well, what do we know? Well, we know that the autumn term numbers, generally speaking, are strong and in our schools. And in fact, unbelievably, a lot of my clients are reporting higher numbers than they've ever had before, particularly in boarding schools, and actually some of the day schools. It is incredible. There really has been a flight to quality, and that's put us in good stead for this financial year. And I can say confidently across the sector, I'm hearing reports of debt being collected for that Michaelmas term quite well. There has been an increased focus on debt collection, and therefore that's paying dividends. And what has lockdown 3 meant? Well, the first thing is, this is not a new phenomenon, sadly. It is not a new phenomenon. So going on to remote learning is absolutely something schools in our sector are doing fabulously well. And thankfully, across the whole education sector, seems to be better than it was the last time. But therefore, parents understand it, pupils understand it, teachers understand it. So there is not as much panic as there was last time, and that is really important. Secondly, last time, in lockdown 1 I'm talking to, which is the comparable one, lots of businesses stopped, the downs tools. That has absolutely not happened now, generally speaking. Our manufacturing businesses, engineering businesses, professional businesses are all continuing to work. So again, that's an implication. Further, lots of schools have more key worker children in than they have had before. There are also people in boarding schools that were not there before. So it is a slightly different look to what it was on lockdown 1. And that means there are more costs. There will be more considerations around furloughing the CJRS system for this time's lockdown. And all of that means, what do we do, or how do we behave around our fees for this term and beyond, should that happen? So the general mood music is that the fees based for this term will be more of a credit against summer term or autumn term, based on cost savings. That's a general position. There are schools out there who have put out their stall and made a discount right now. But those schools, generally speaking, are the ones that gave a lesser discount in the summer term. But as I say, it is more about the cost savings that you are making in this term and making the relevant credit, if you think that's appropriate, in the summer term. And of course, a lot of schools are delivering a much fuller timetable than they did last time. So it's virtually, the education is as it was in the school. I mean, I'm not an educationist, but a lot of the stuff that comes around education in our schools isn't happening clearly. But there is a different feel around it this time. So I urge schools to quickly understand what the particular savings they can make, and therefore what potential fee saving they could pass on to parents. And that needs to be factored in to all the forecasting and planning that's going on at the moment. Which brings me on to the most important point. Cash is king and remains king. Understanding your cash position, and how it's moving, because over the last 6 months, things have moved fast. What we thought was going to happen and how bad it was going to be, generally speaking, has not happened. And therefore, we need to understand the impact of that on our cash position. What have we done to manage our cash position? Have we had CBILS loans? That's the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, which is available, and a number of my clients have taken that, a number of schools have done. That's still available. Is that something that you want to have a look at and apply for now? Of course, one has to look at your cash covenants. But I think what's interesting, and talking to a lot of school clients, is a lot of maintenance and capital was put on hold back in the summer, and now some schools are taking the opportunity of this period of time to catch up. Let's remember, in the past, we've always talked about delayed maintenance costing more money in the long term. So is there an opportunity for you with well-managed cash to look back and speed up some of the maintenance that was delayed in the past, to ensure that you're managing the risk of future cost? And then we look at our enterprise activities. And of course, those were hindered impacted quite heavily over the summer. But let's now think about what we can do in relation to gearing up some of those activities so that we can bring some more cash into school. Of course, nurseries are still open, and if you're lucky enough to have a nursery, they will be operating, and the ones that I know of are full. and are therefore operating as normal, making a contribution to school that was not there before. All of that needs to be considered when you're looking at your finances and your cash. So let's to the next slide, please, and look at what's happening now and what we should be looking at going forward. There's two or three things that I want to think about, actually. There's the medium term and the long term, and all of this needs to be considered in relation to the available funds that you've got. So there's a change in expenditure profile, waste audits, TPS has been covered by Chrissy earlier on, and Mason's profile I talked about. But let's think about the change in expenditure profile. So what have you done differently over the last 6 months that has been speeded up, that speeded up as a result of COVID? For example, let's think about IB. A lot of schools have decided to pull away from IB. Let's think about the different subjects that you're offering that are very costly. I've said before in these examples, in these sorts of seminars or webinars, that if you look at your school, if you're a senior school, you make money in GCSEs, and at no other point do you make money. In other words, A levels are very expensive, as is year 1 and 2. GCSEs are good. So look at your A levels, look at who's taking what, and actually ask yourselves, do we still need to offer the vast range of A levels that we are doing? Now, there are educationalists here, and they will be shooting me, but from a financial point of view, it's important to consider that. What is your school? What are we offering? And can we afford to offer that? We are a charity after all, and we must deliver our charitable objects. So this is part of that consideration. And as I say, look at your expenditure profile. What will be interesting to look at is looking at your staff that have been furloughed over this period of time, and actually what are they, look at them, what they do, and the contribution they make. And is that an opportunity to review those people to do something different, or to reduce cost in some of those activities? I think that's a very important thing to do. Waste audits, I've written down that. I've written it down because I'm doing a number of them for a number of clients, looking at where their expenditure is and what they can do to look to remove that. And one of the key areas that I'm looking at, and have been looking at, is management levels of management, and what management are doing, and therefore what they're being paid to do. And I think that's a real opportunity for governors and school leaders to senior school leaders to look at the levels of management that they have, and ask themselves, have we got, are we doubling up in certain areas? And I guarantee you will be. So it's something that's worth having a look at. There's something called the straw man, which is a theory that is worth Googling and having a look at, and that will give you some indicators around how you could look at management. TPS is up the agenda, as Chrissy said. I'm not going to go into that anymore, other than to confirm in every conversation I've had, it is on the agenda, higher up than it was 9 months ago. Then we look at merging, and I know Kate has been talking about that, but I think there are opportunities to look at the back office as well, working more closely with colleagues in certain areas, and that's absolutely something that should be being done. And if we look at our geography of schools, one of the key things that seems to be happening is that where there are, let's say, 3 schools, 3-day schools operating in a community, it appears to be that 2 will be going well, and 1 that was already a little bit in danger, that danger has been speeded up as a result of COVID. And that needs to be considered when you are one of the, in terms of looking at your finances. Understand if that is happening to you. Look at the merging opportunities, look at the opportunities around continuing to deliver your charitable objects via merging or working more collaboratively. If you're one of the 2 schools that are striving in my example, you will see indicators like people moving from one school to your school, people moving from the state sector to your school. And what are you going to do to ensure that you maximize those sorts of opportunities for your school. And that could be looking at your expenditure profile, looking at your back office, working more collaboratively with your local schools, or indeed taking on opportunities to merge. So for me, there are 2 or 3 key things that are right in the moment. Debtors, cash, looking at what your school's going to look like going forward. So if we were to horizon scan and we thought about our school, what's going to change? And I'll give you some thoughts around that now. So if we're a boarding school, and there are a number of boarding schools on this call, the market and sounds that I'm hearing across the market are people are looking at their offering and saying, should we open up to more day schools? People are moving from London, as an example, to live nearer out of London because they're working different changes, which means that they can live nearer schools where they once would have aspired to send their child to as a boarder, and now wanting to send that child as a day pupil. So there are boarding schools across the country looking at opening up day opportunities. What does that mean for your school? Are there opportunities there for you, or are there increased risks? Taking that a step further, there are indications of boarders wanting to convert to day. Now, if you're a boarding school with boarding houses where they're integrated with day, turning a boarder into a day costs you money. So what does that mean in the context of looking at your school? And an increased day offering versus what you've got as boarding. So those are things to think about in the long term. If you're a day school, I've talked about the opportunities of parents changing their spending profiles or spending priorities and moving from state to our independent day schools. And that is absolutely happening in most counties across the country that I deal with, and I'm around a lot of those counties. So there is opportunity there and planning for that. And that brings me to marketing. Marketing is a cost. And traditionally it's been done in the way that it has been, face to face, talking about how good our school is and our buildings and the extracurricular activities. But actually, what are parents really, really interested in? And if you talk to parents and you talk to schools, it's about the security of the education offering. And so let's think about that and I know we do, but let's think about that when we think about our marketing. So right now is the opportunity to review our marketing strategies to ensure we're maximizing the opportunities that our school has to offer. So for me, there are financial indicators that need to be understood in order to inform strategy going forward. And we've touched on just a few of the things that we're having conversations about. But it's important that governors are aware of them and governors take the opportunity to look at them as they discuss what's happening within their own school right now. Moving to the next slide, I just wanted to touch on this in the last couple of minutes because it is really, really important. Clearly, I'm an auditor and I've done a lot of schools audits over the last 3 or 4 months, but I've got a lot still going on and already planning for this year. And going concern is a key consideration. It's important from an accounting point of view, obviously, for the accounts and the financial statements, but it's important that you know that you are a going concern at any point in the year. But when we look at the financial statements, the going concern is for a period of not less than 12 months from a balance sheet date, and that's from the date the financial statements are authorised. And that's when we look at a period to make sure you're a going concern. And the financial indicators that I've just been describing are absolutely critical to that review. Turning to the next slide, just to give you a little bit more detail of it. This is what it tells you in the guidance. I suggest you just read that and take that in. It's aimed at governors here for them to understand that it's important that they believe that they're a going concern. And the next slide, please. And these are the things to think about which relate to the financial indicators. How is your school funded? Interesting thought. Pupil numbers obviously are the main thing, but a lot of schools rely on other incoming activities, which is crucial to what they're doing. Have a look at what you're doing. I've got a number of clients that their school actually makes a loss The only reason it makes money is because of the innovative, fantastic things they do to raise income from other sources. I've told you about impacts on immediate liquidity and longer term solvency. That's why, I mean, it's so important for governors and senior leaders to understand what they're saying in relation to those financial indicators. Look at your reserves, understand the level of reserves you hold, what reserves you need to hold given your school's financial position. Are the things that you're going to have to do to bring you to a break-even position in 2 or 3 years' time. You'll need reserves to implement strategy. Of course, look at your stress testing and sensitivity analysis. We've been really good at that over the last 9 or 10 months. We don't stop, we continue. As we learn more about those indicators, the more important and more relevant and more accurate our stress testing becomes. So in conclusion, there is a lot going on. We're in a strong position though, generally speaking. Those indicators are absolutely crucial. Cash remains king. I think those are the things that governors need to look at. I think that's my last slide, and I think that's the end of my time. Oh no, I've got one more slide. Can you put the next slide up just to show these are a lot? It's a bit of self-promotion, but these are only from the basis of the fact that these are really worth looking at. On our website, these are all the webinars that are available. I think they're really valuable for people to have a moment to look at around VAT, fraud, cybercrime, trustee essentials on reserves and going concern, much more than I've been able to say in 20 minutes. So thank you very much. Any questions in the last section? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guy. Brilliant, brilliant rundown and very, very helpful challenges to us there. I'm very glad you talked about strategy towards the end, which is, if you've come on any of our webinars, you'll hear me talking about that. And for the future, it's absolutely vital to keep an eye on that. So we have only got a few minutes left. I'm afraid we do need to finish on time because the platform is needed for another webinar almost immediately. We're all very, very busy with these things. What if we don't get to your question, and there are a number that we probably won't get to, we will either post them with the recording or get in touch with you to answer them directly to you, or both. So don't worry, they won't be missed. So I'm going to try to come to 1 or 2 questions before we finish now, but I'm afraid we won't have time to get to them all. Edward Valletta asks whether is there an up-to-date advice for schools dealing with complaints about CAGs, that's the exam grades, or school assessed grades, and if they're out of the school's hand, it would be useful to put some standard words into the policy. I don't know if we have any standard wording that schools can use in policies, Chrissy, do we?
Not at the moment, no. And of course, although we're still dealing with some complaints relating to last year's CAGs, we're still waiting for the exam assessment, the off-core consultation. So I think once we've got that, we know that teachers are going to be assessing the grades. I think we'll then take a view and maybe have some generic wording as an addendum, but that's a wait and see. We'll come back to you on that, if that's okay. Okay. There's quite a detailed question from Christy Hawksworth about teacher allowances. I'm not sure whether whoever it was who was dealing with that breakout group could deal with this now, or do you want to follow that up later on? It's about teachers who have allowances in addition to their salaries when they're furloughed. I don't know, there's quite a long question. I don't know whether you're able to see that.
Yes, we've dealt with the first part of that, and we're happy to follow up separately if that would be easier. Okay, maybe follow up separately on that. The second part was about training. Are those hours paid at their normal rate? And will you follow that up as well separately? Yes, I mean, it's quite a quick answer, actually. Yes. If someone does any work-related training while on furlough, you continue to pay them in accordance with your furlough arrangement. So if it's at 80%, unless it amounts to less than national minimum wage, and then you would have to top it up over national minimum wage. Okay, thank you. I know there was another question in the general chat, which I can't see. For some reason, it didn't pop up for me. And someone was going to remind me what it was. One of the technical team, I think, was going to remind me what it was, if you could do that. Okay, here we go. Thank you very much. Given the immense pressure staff have been under and will be under for the foreseeable future, yes, that's where we started an hour and a half ago with that point. How are governors avoiding the accusation that they're being insensitive in consulting now? I think that means around TPS, if you go into TPS consultation. Over to you, Chrissy.
Yes, quite. I mean, it is an issue. So when they are consulting, the unions quite understandably are saying that it's not an appropriate time to consult. There's too much going on. Teachers have a lot on their plate. But the arguments, as I set out previously, counter that, really, in that if they have to get on with it, they have to get on with it and be as sensitive as possible.
Yeah, I think it's about how it's handled, isn't it? But if you've got to do it, you've got to do it. And at the end of the day, you've got to have a school so that there are jobs. You know, you don't want to say that up front, as it were, but that is the message underneath it, really. But communicate sensitively as far as you possibly can. Of course, that's important to retain relationships. I'm going to give a last one. I think Kate and or Robin had a question left from your session. If you want to just deal with that, if you could in 1 minute, that'd be brilliant. If it will take longer, maybe we'll follow it up separately.
Okay, yeah, so we have two questions, one from Gary, one from Ian, and so we will have to follow up some of them separately, which we're very happy to do. Just in relation to Gary, so Gary asked, are there any schools that have become insolvent during COVID? And are there two things in particular we can two or three actions that have saved schools? And very briefly, but Gary, we will contact you to give you a fuller answer, but very briefly, this is where Robin and I work together. So from my side, what I would say is the schools that have avoided closure, who otherwise would have done, are the ones that have contacted us early enough. We have been able to put them in touch with potential purchasers or schools to merge with, or ISBA, for example, or AGBIS have been able to introduce them to people. As a result, they have found someone to purchase them or merge with, and that has saved them. Robin, I'm going to hand over to you, because the reason we have to work together on this is, whilst I'm working on that side of things, you at the same time are advising a school in that situation on their cash flow and the importance of an estimated outcome statement at that point.
You've got 20 seconds, Robin.
Okay, that's fine. I reiterate what Guy said, if that's the case, which is basically understand the financial position, make sure that your financial statements are accurate, but also make sure that you forecast correctly and that you manage that forecasting on a regular basis. It's about understanding your financial position. The better you understand it, the easier it is to seek advice at the right time.
Thank you ever so much, and thank you to Kate. And with that, I'm going to just sum up very briefly. There's an awful lot, of course, going on. There's an awful lot to take on board. I think today, however, in the last hour and a half, you've had a huge range of expertise, and I'm really grateful to all colleagues at HCI. I won't name you all individually. You can see them on the screen, and all those that you can't see who are behind the scenes making it all run smoothly. Hugely grateful also to Guy, who gave a brilliant presentation there just now, and thinking about looking ahead. It's very important to keep on top of all this, folks. So please do keep on coming. We've got a range of excellent webinars available. Look at our website, the AGBIS website. Obviously, Guy has mentioned the ones that he does. HCR are doing a lot. And we're all working together as hard as we can to keep you informed and to enable you to do your job as well as possible in governing our schools and seeing them through this crisis and out in a flourishing sense to the other side. So all best wishes to everybody for 2021. I probably should have wished you a happy new year at the top of the session, but let's hope it's happier than the last 12 months has been, and things get better and better. But I think we are going to have some tough challenges still probably for several years to come. I hope today has helped to equip you or begin to equip you for some of those. So thanks to everybody, best wishes, and we will see you soon, I hope. Keep in touch. Bye-bye now.